The alarm on Jake Martinez's phone buzzed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 12 years. But when he flicked on the light switch in his modest farmhouse kitchen, nothing happened. He tried again, pressing harder as if that would somehow coax electricity from the dead circuit. Still darkness. "Power's out," he muttered to himself, reaching for his phone's flashlight. Living on a working farm 30 miles outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, power outages weren't uncommon during storms. But the October morning was crisp and clear, without so much as a breeze rustling the corn stalks that stretched endlessly beyond his back porch. Jake pulled on his work boots and stepped outside, scanning the horizon for any signs of downed power lines or utility trucks. The neighboring farmhouse, the Henderson place that had been sold 6 months ago, glowed warmly in the pre-dawn darkness. Their power was clearly working fine. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The main electrical meter that served his property was gone. Not damaged, not hanging loose, completely removed, leaving only bare wires and an empty mounting bracket on the utility pole at the edge of his driveway. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. He walked closer to the pole, his phone's flashlight illuminating what looked like fresh tool marks on the metal housing. Someone had deliberately disconnected his power, and they'd done it recently. The Henderson place shared the same utility pole, but their connection remained intact, their meters still humming quietly above his head. Jake's mind raced as he considered the implications. Without electricity, his farm was essentially dead in the water. The automated milking system for his 40-head dairy operation would be offline. The refrigeration units storing thousands of dollars worth of milk would begin warming within hours. The water pumps that supplied his livestock would stop working. Even his backup generator couldn't handle the full electrical load of the entire operation. He immediately called the power company's emergency line, pacing in tight circles as he waded through an automated menu system that seemed designed to frustrate customers into hanging up. "This is Jake Martinez at 1247 County Road 18, he said when a human voice finally answered. "Someone has removed my electrical meter completely. I need emergency service immediately." The customer service representative, who sounded like she was reading from a script, informed him that meter removals required prior authorization and that there must be some mistake in their records. She scheduled a technician for later that morning but couldn't provide an exact time. Later that morning, Jake's voice cracked with disbelief. "I run a dairy farm. Every hour without power is costing me hundreds of dollars in spoiled milk and stressed cattle. This needs to be fixed now." As the sun began to rise, painting the Iowa sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake heard the rumble of a diesel engine approaching. A white pickup truck turned into his driveway and his heart sank as he recognized the driver. Karen Whitfield, his new neighbor and apparently his new nemesis. Karen had purchased the Henderson farm with her husband 6 months earlier, moving from Chicago with big plans to embrace rural living. From their very first interaction, when she complained about the overwhelming smell of manure drifting from his property, Jake knew they were going to have problems. She stepped out of her truck wearing designer jeans that probably cost more than Jake spent on groceries in a month, her perfectly styled blonde hair untouched by the morning breeze. "Good morning, Jake," she called out with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Having some electrical troubles." Jake stared at Karen, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The casual way she asked about his electrical troubles sent alarm bells ringing in his head. How could she possibly know about the power situation unless she was involved? "As a matter of fact, I am," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Someone removed my electrical meter during the night. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, will you?" Karen's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Oh my goodness, that's terrible. Who would do such a thing?" She paused, tapping her finger against her glossy lips. "Though I have to say, Jake, maybe this is a sign. You know, the universe telling you it's time to consider relocating your operation." "My operation?" Jake stepped closer, towering over Karen's petite frame. "You mean my family farm that's been here for 3 generations?" "Well, yes," Karen continued, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Jake's skin crawl. "I mean, we moved out here for peace and tranquility. The smell from your cows, the noise from your machinery at all hours, the flies, it's really affecting our quality of life. My husband's been having terrible allergies ever since we moved in." Jake felt his jaw drop. "Lady, you bought a house next to a working dairy farm. What exactly did you think you were getting into?" Karen's mask of pleasantness began to slip. "I thought we could work together like civilized neighbors. Maybe you could reduce your herd, install some sort of odor control system, limit your work hours to something more reasonable." "Reasonable?" Jake's voice rose an octave. "Cows need to be milked twice a day, every day. They don't care about your sleep schedule, and neither does the milk truck that picks up at 6 a.m. "Well, perhaps that's something that needs to change," Karen said, her tone turning icy. I've been doing some research, and there are several county ordinances about agricultural operations that might apply to your situation. The power company truck finally rumbled up the driveway, interrupting their heated exchange. Jake watched as the technician, a weathered man named Bill, whom he'd known for years, examined the empty meter socket with a puzzled expression. "This is the strangest thing I've seen in 20 years, Bill said, scratching his head. "Someone used professional tools to remove this meter. Had to know exactly what they were doing to disconnect it without damaging the lines." "How long to get it reconnected?" Jake asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Well, that's the problem," Bill replied, pulling out his tablet. "According to our records, the disconnection was requested by the property owner. Says here you called yesterday and asked for immediate service termination due to a property sale." Jake's blood turned to ice. "I never called for any disconnection. I don't know what you're talking about." Bill scrolled through his screen, frowning. "Says here the call came in at 2:47 p.m. yesterday. Caller identified herself as, let me see, Jake Martinez, requested immediate power termination for property transfer. Even provided the correct account number and service address, herself." Jake turned to stare at Karen, who had gone pale despite her foundation. "A woman called pretending to be me?" "Now that you mention it," Bill said slowly, the voice did seem a little high for a Jake. "We get prank calls sometimes, but they had all the right information. So," Karen took a step backward toward her truck. "Well, this has been fascinating, but I really should get going. I hope you get your power situation sorted out, Jake. These mix-ups happen all the time." "Not so fast," Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man pushed too far. "Bill, is there any way to trace that call?" "Sure," as Bill replied, still tapping on his tablet. "All our service calls are recorded for quality assurance. I can pull up the audio file right now if you'd like." Karen's face went from pale to bright red. "I really don't think that's necessary. I mean, what would be the point? It's probably just some teenager playing pranks." Jake pulled out his phone and started recording. "Actually, Bill, I'd love to hear that call. Put it on speaker." The scratchy audio filled the morning air. "Hi, this is Jake Martinez calling about my service at 1247 County Road 18. I need to have my power disconnected immediately due to a property sale. My account number is 4471 to 8829 2245. The voice was unmistakably feminine, with a slight Chicago accent that Jake had become all too familiar with over the past 6 months. Karen's truck engine roared to life behind them. "I really have to go," she called out, backing rapidly down the driveway. "Good luck with everything." Bill stared after the retreating truck, then looked at Jake with wide eyes. "Was that my neighbor?" Jake confirmed grimly. "The one who just happened to show up this morning asking about my electrical troubles." "Son," Bill said, shaking his head, "I think you need to call the sheriff. And probably a lawyer." As Karen's truck disappeared around the bend, Jake realized this was far from over. His new neighbor had just declared war, and she fired the first shot. But she'd also made a crucial mistake. She'd left evidence. By 10 a.m., Jake had filed a police report, scheduled an appointment with attorney Sarah Chen in town, and begun documenting every interaction he ever had with Karen Whitfield. His farm might be without power, but his resolve had never been stronger. Karen wanted a fight. She was about to get one. 3 days later, Jake sat across from attorney Sarah Chen in her downtown Cedar Rapids office, a thick mantle of folders spread between them on her polished oak desk. The lawyer was younger than Jake had expected, probably in her early 30s, but her reputation for handling agricultural disputes was legendary in the county. "Mr. Martinez," Sarah said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she reviewed the police report, "what Mrs. Whitfield did constitutes several serious crimes. Identity theft, fraud, interference with a business operation, and potentially criminal mischief. The recorded phone call alone is enough to press charges." Jake shifted in his chair, still wearing his work clothes after spending the morning dealing with his power restoration. The utility company had finally reconnected his service, but not before he'd lost nearly $3,000 worth of spoiled milk and veterinary bills for stressed cattle. "I want more than criminal charges," Jake said firmly. "This woman cost me money, threatened my livelihood, and made it clear she's not done. I want to make sure she can't do this again." Sarah nodded, making notes on her legal pad. "Civil litigation is definitely an option. Based on your documented losses and the malicious nature of her actions, we could pursue damages for business interruption, emotional distress, and punitive damages to deter future conduct." "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" "Well," Sarah leaned back in her chair, "your immediate financial losses are around $3,000. But if we can prove a pattern of harassment and intentional interference with your business operations, a jury might award significantly more. I've seen similar cases settle for anywhere from $25,000 to $100,000. depending on the severity and the defendant's ability to pay. Jake's eyebrows shot up. That much? Mrs. Whitfield and her husband aren't exactly living paycheck to paycheck, Sarah replied with a slight smile. I did some preliminary research. He's a retired investment banker, and they paid $850,000 cash for the Henderson property. They can afford to face the consequences of their actions. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined their legal strategy. They would file both criminal complaints and a civil lawsuit simultaneously. The recorded phone call was their smoking gun, that they needed to build a broader case showing Karen's pattern of harassment and her intent to drive Jake off his land. I need you to document everything, Sarah instructed. Every conversation, every complaint she's made, every interaction. Do you have any witnesses to her previous behavior? Jake thought for a moment. Actually, yes. Tom Henderson, the guy who sold her the property, he warned me about her during the sale process. Said she'd been asking all sorts of questions about dealing with the farm smell and whether there were any legal ways to force agricultural operations to relocate. Sarah's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. That's excellent. Premeditated intent. Anyone else? The mail carrier, Betty Rodriguez. Karen stopped her last month complaining about the flies and asking if there were health department violations she could report. Betty thought it was strange enough to mention it to me. Perfect. We'll need sworn statements from both of them. As Jake prepared to leave, Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and held up a finger. This is interesting. It's actually Karen Whitfield's attorney. Jake paused at the door as Sarah answered the call, her expression growing more amused by the second. I see, Sarah said into the phone. And your client would like to propose what kind of settlement? A long pause. Mr. Peterson, with all due respect, your client committed multiple felonies and cost my client thousands of dollars. A fruit basket and an apology card isn't exactly what we had in mind. Jake couldn't help but grin as he listened to Sarah's side of the conversation. No, Mr. Peterson, we will not be dropping the charges in exchange for your client agreeing to be more neighborly. In fact, let me save us both some time. We'll be filing our civil complaint tomorrow morning, and unless your client is prepared to discuss meaningful compensation for the damages she's caused, I suggest you advise her to prepare for a very public trial. Sarah hung up and looked at Jake with satisfaction. Well, that was enlightening. Apparently, Mrs. Whitfield thought she could make this go away with a token gesture and promise to behave. Her lawyer sounded about as confident as a turkey in November. 2 weeks later, Jake stood on his front porch reading the local newspaper's front-page article, City Transplant Accused of Sabotaging Local Farm. The reporter had done her homework, interviewing several other farmers who had run-ins with new urban residents trying to change rural life to suit their preferences. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Karen's lawyer called again. She's panicking. They want to discuss a real settlement. Are you interested in hearing their offer? Jake looked out over his fields, where his cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. 3 generations of Martinez men had worked this land, and he'd be damned if some entitled city transplant was going to drive him away. He typed back, only if the number starts with a 5 and has 4 more digits after it. Otherwise, I'll see her in court. Within an hour, Sarah called back. They're offering $15,000 to settle everything and avoid trial. What do you think? Jake watched his cattle gathering near the fence, waiting for their evening feeding. These animals depended on him, just like his father and grandfather had depended on this land to provide for their families. Counter-offered, Jake said, $50,000 plus a written apology published in the county newspaper, plus a legally binding agreement that she won't interfere with farm operations ever again. And she pays all our legal fees. Sarah chuckled. I like the way you think, Mr. Martinez. But you realize if she refuses, we're going to trial. Are you prepared for that? Jake thought about Karen's smug face that morning when she'd asked about his electrical troubles. He thought about the stress on his cattle, the thousands of dollars in losses, and the sleepless nights wondering what she might do next. Sarah, he said firmly, I've been fighting to keep this farm running my whole adult life. Weather, market prices, equipment failures, sick animals, I've dealt with it all. But I'll be damned if I'm going to let some bored housewife from Chicago destroy what 3 generations of my family built. If she wants a war, she picked the wrong farmer. 6 weeks later, the Lynn County Courthouse was packed with more spectators than Judge Patricia Hoffman had seen in her 20-year career. Word had spread throughout the farming community about the city Karen versus country Jake case, and it seemed like half the county had shown up to watch the proceedings. Jake sat at the plaintiff's table beside Sarah Chen, wearing his only suit, the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral 5 years earlier. Across the aisle, Karen Whitfield looked like she was attending the country club luncheon, dressed in an expensive navy blazer and pearls, her husband Richard beside her in a $1,000 suit. Karen's attorney, Michael Peterson, was a slick corporate lawyer from Des Moines who clearly wished he was anywhere else. During jury selection, his condescending questions about understanding the complexities of modern neighborhood disputes had visibly annoyed the panel of 12 jurors, 8 of whom had rural backgrounds themselves. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sarah began her opening statement. This case is about more than a power outage. It's about what happens when someone decides that their comfort is more important than their neighbor's livelihood, their family's legacy, and the law itself. She walked to the evidence table and held up a printed transcript of the recorded phone call. The defendant, Karen Whitfield, deliberately impersonated my client to have his electricity shut off, knowing full well that this would threaten the lives of 40 dairy cattle and destroy thousands of dollars worth of milk. She did this not in a moment of anger, but as part of a calculated campaign to drive the Martinez family off land they farmed for 3 generations. Jake watched the jurors' faces as Sarah outlined their case. Several nodded when she mentioned the 3 generations of farming. These were people who understood the value of hard work and heritage. Peterson's opening statement was a disaster from the first sentence. My client simply made an error in judgment, he began, immediately admitting guilt. Mrs. Whitfield is new to rural living and perhaps didn't fully understand the impact of her actions on Mr. Martinez's business operations. One juror, a weathered woman named Helen Bass, who Jake recognized from the grain elevator, actually rolled her eyes. The first day of testimony was devastating for Karen's defense. Bill from the power company played the recorded phone call, and the courtroom fell silent as Karen's voice clearly stated Jake's name and account information. When asked to identify the voice, Bill pointed directly at Karen. That's definitely the woman who made the call, he testified. I've heard that voice 3 times now. Once on the phone, once when she drove up during the reconnection, and once here in court today. Betty Rodriguez, the mail carrier, testified about Karen's complaints and her specific questions about reporting health violations. She asked me if the health department could shut down a farm for fly problems, Betty said. I told her that flies are just part of country living, but she seemed very interested in what kind of violations might force a farm to close. The courtroom murmured when Tom Henderson took the stand. The former property owner testified that Karen had asked him repeatedly about dealing the farm odors during the sale process. She wanted to know if there were any legal precedents for forcing agricultural operations to relocate, Tom said. I told her she was buying a house next to a working farm, and if she couldn't handle that, maybe she should look elsewhere. She said she was confident she could find a solution to the problem. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. During cross-examination, Peterson made the mistake of calling Karen's husband Richard to the stand, hoping to portray her as a stressed newcomer who'd simply made a bad decision. Mr. Whitfield, Sarah said during her cross-examination, were you aware of your wife's plan to have Mr. Martinez's power disconnected? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I would discuss the farm situation, yes. And by situation, you mean your wife's desire to force Mr. Martinez to relocate his farm operation? Peterson jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Leading the witness. I'll rephrase, Sarah said smoothly. Mr. Whitfield, what exactly did you and your wife discuss regarding the Martinez farm? Richard's face went pale. She said she had a plan to make him see reason. That once he realized how expensive farming problems could be, he might consider selling and moving somewhere more appropriate. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Hoffman banged her gavel, but the damage was done. Karen's own husband had just admitted she planned the sabotage as part of a scheme to drive Jake off his land. Karen's testimony on the 3rd day was a complete meltdown. She started by claiming she called the power company by mistake, then switched to saying she was trying to help by getting Jake's attention about some imaginary safety issue with his electrical system. Mrs. Whitfield, Sarah said calmly, you testified that you called to report a safety concern. But the recorded call shows you requesting immediate service termination for a property sale. Which is it? I was confused. I'm not used to dealing with utility companies. But you provided Mr. Martinez's correct account number, his full name, and his service address. How would you have that information if you were simply reporting a safety concern? Karen's face flushed red. I don't remember exactly what I said. Sarah walked to the evidence table and picked up the transcript. Would you like me to play the recording again to refresh your memory? No, Karen snapped, then caught herself. I mean, that won't be necessary. Mrs. Whitfield, do you believe that dairy farming is an appropriate use of rural land? Peterson objected, but Judge Hoffman overruled him. I think, Karen said, her composure finally cracking, that people should be considerate of their neighbors. Some activities just don't belong in civilized areas. Civilized areas, Sarah repeated. Are you saying that Mr. Martinez's farm is uncivilized? I'm saying that some practices might have been acceptable 50 years ago, but we need to evolve. We need to think about quality of life, property values, modern standards of living. So do you believe your quality of life is more important than Mr. Martinez's constitutional right to use his property as he sees fit? Objection, Peterson called out desperately. Withdrawn, Sarah said with a smile. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted. During closing arguments, Sarah stood before the jury with quiet confidence. Members of the jury, the defendant has admitted that she deliberately sabotaged my client's business as part of a calculated plan to drive him from his land. She has shown no remorse, no understanding of the harm she caused, and no respect for the rights of others. This is not about rural versus urban, old versus new. This is about the fundamental principle that you cannot destroy your neighbor's livelihood simply because it inconveniences you. Jake watched the jury file up for deliberations, his heart pounding. Everything he'd worked for, everything his family had built, was now in the hands of 12 strangers. They were back in less than 2 hours. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hoffman asked as the 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom. Helen Bass, the grain elevator worker who'd been elected jury foreman, stood up with a folded piece of paper in her weathered hands. We have your honor. Jake's mouth felt dry as sandpaper. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but he could feel the tension radiating from her as well. Across the aisle, Karen sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. In the matter of Martinez versus Whitfield, Helen announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, with the jury find in favor of the plaintiff, Jake Martinez. The courthouse erupted in applause from the packed gallery. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief, but Helen wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, raising her voice over the commotion, we award the plaintiff compensatory damages in the amount of $15,000 for business losses and emotional distress. Jake's heart sank slightly. $15,000 was better than nothing, but it was far less than the $50,000 he demanded. Helen paused, looking directly at Karen before continuing. And we award punitive damages in the amount of $35,000 for a total judgment of $50,000. This time the applause was deafening. Jake stared at Helen in disbelief, then turned to Sarah, who was grinning from ear to ear. They'd gotten everything they'd asked for, every single penny. Judge Hoffman banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Ladies and gentlemen, please. This is still a courtroom. When the noise finally died down, she turned to Karen. Mrs. Whitfield, you are ordered to pay the full judgment of $50,000 to Mr. Martinez within 30 days. Additionally, the court hereby issues a permanent injunction prohibiting you from interfering with Mr. Martinez's farming operations in any way, shape, or form. Any violation of this injunction will result in contempt of court charges and potential jail time. Karen's face had gone completely white. She whispered something frantically to her lawyer, who just shook his head grimly. Furthermore, Judge Hoffman continued, given the premeditated nature of your actions and your lack of remorse, I am ordering you to pay Mr. Martinez's legal fees in the amount of $8,500. The total amount you owe is $58,500. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only had he won, but Karen would have to pay Sarah's fees as well. Outside the courthouse, Jake was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers from the farming community. Tom Henderson slapped him on the back, grinning broadly. That's what I call Yoa justice, Tom said. 3 generations of farming trumps 6 months of complaining every time. Sarah Chen stood beside Jake, fielding questions from reporters with professional grace. This case sends a clear message, she told the Channel 9 news crew. You cannot sabotage your neighbor's livelihood simply because you don't like their way of life. Rural communities have rights too, and those rights will be protected. One reporter asked Jake how he planned to spend the money. First, I'm upgrading my electrical system with a backup generator that can handle my entire operation, he said. Then I'm putting the rest into a legal defense fund for other farmers who might face similar harassment. This won't be the last time some city transplant tries to shut down a working farm. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake noticed Karen and Richard loading boxes into their Mercedes SUV parked at the far end of the courthouse lot. Word around town was that they'd already put their house on the market and were moving back to Chicago. Apparently, rural living hadn't worked out quite the way they'd imagined. 3 months later, Jake stood in his newly upgraded electrical room, admiring the industrial-grade backup generator that could power his entire farm operation for a week if necessary. The local newspaper had run a follow-up story about the case, noting that 2 other farmers in neighboring counties had successfully used the Martinez precedent to fight harassment from urban transplants. The Henderson place had sold to a young couple from Iowa City, both agriculture graduates who were excited to start their own small organic farm. They'd stopped by to introduce themselves the day they moved in, asking Jake for advice about soil management and offering to help with hay baling in exchange for learning the ropes. That's how neighbors should behave, Jake had told Sarah when he called to update her on the new arrivals. On a crisp November morning, almost exactly 1 year after Karen had cut his power, Jake walked out to check his mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $1,847 and a brief note written in Karen's distinctive handwriting. Mr. Martinez, this is the additional interest owed on the judgment as calculated by my attorney. I hope you're satisfied with destroying our dreams of country living. Some people have no appreciation for progress and modernization. K. Whitfield. Jake chuckled as he read the note. Even in defeat, Karen couldn't resist getting in the last word and playing the victim. He walked back to the house and called Sarah. She sent the interest payment, he reported, along with a note suggesting I somehow destroyed her dreams. Sarah laughed. Her dreams of forcing you off your own land, you mean? I'd say justice was served just fine. Any word on whether she's bothering farmers in whatever Chicago suburb she moved back to? Actually, funny you should ask, Jake said, settling into his kitchen chair with his morning coffee. Tom Henderson called yesterday. Apparently, she's been posting on social media about the backwards farmers who refuse to embrace modern living. She's trying to start some kind of organization to reform rural agricultural practices. Well, Sarah said, at least she's someone else's problem now. And thanks to our case, other farmers will have legal precedent if they face similar harassment. Jake looked out his kitchen window at his cattle grazing peacefully in the morning sun. The same view his father and grandfather had enjoyed, the same routine that had sustained 3 generations of Martinez men. Thanks to 12 fair-minded jurors and 1 excellent lawyer, it would continue to sustain many more. His phone buzzed with a text from his new neighbors. Jake, our first batch of organic beef cattle arrives next week. Any chance you could help us get them settled? Happy to trade fresh vegetables from our greenhouse. Jake smiled as he typed back, be right over. Welcome to the neighborhood. Some battles were worth fighting and some victories were worth savoring. Karen Whitfield had learned that the hard way to the tune of $58,500. But more importantly, she learned that Iowa farmers don't back down from bullies, no matter how much money they have or how entitled they feel. The Martinez farm would keep running just as it always had, just as it always would. And that was worth more than any lawsuit judgment could ever be.